welcome the first of our guest speakers. Richard Gros is the Policy and Innovation Manager at the ENA. Richard is going to share distributors' perspectives on the draft guidance. Thank you, Richard, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gary. So I understand I'm supposed to share my own screen here, so hopefully this all works okay. Tell me if that's popping up. Yes, okay. So as Gary said, I'm Richard Gros. I'm the Policy and Innovation Manager at Electricity Networks Aotearoa. What I have here is a summary, I guess, of some of the feedback ENA has received from its EDB members. There's much more than this that we have gathered, which we'll be providing to the authority after this event. And so this is not necessarily the view of every EDB. This is what ENA has sort of distilled out of a much larger amount of feedback we've received. I'm going to skate over some of this because, as we've found out, we're very short on time. So moving right along. So first thing, we think there should be a more formal consultation process undertaken for this guidance. We appreciate it as guidance, but nevertheless, we think that the changes required to comply with the principles in the guide, particularly if it encompasses hot water ripple control, are potentially quite significant for EDBs. And so a more structured, formal, sort of question and response style consultation process we think would be warranted for the benefits both of EDBs, the authority, and all stakeholders. We note that hot water ripple control in aggregate is a very significant amount of controllable load across New Zealand, and to simply introduce some guidance, you know, that makes pretty fundamental changes to how that all works without a more structured process is not sound in our view. Again, or sort of reiterating that point, the definition of flexibility given in the glossary appears to encompass hot water ripple control. However, it would be helpful if the authority were absolutely explicit on that point, because again, you'll see most of our comments are related to some of the challenges we see with accommodating the existing hot water ripple control systems and adhering to the principles in this guide. EDB support for community energy schemes. You know, some EDBs see a very important role for themselves in supporting the activities in energy that their communities undertake, and potentially there might be areas where that support might undermine or appear to be counter to some of the principles in the guidance, and you know, might undermine some of those charitable or community-minded endeavours. Transitional matters, Rob sort of mentioned this briefly, so it was useful to get a little bit more detail there. But again, you know, a more structured consultation process would give us more certainty about how exactly the transition towards compliance with the guide would be monitored, you know, how our adherence to the guide would be monitored, what the penalties might be for non-adherence, and so on and so forth. I'm going to skip that one. Workability, again, if hot water ripple control is in scope, this is where we see some very significant challenges, particularly for the small and medium-sized EDBs, but also potentially for the larger ones, in terms of separating out those parts of their business that operate their hot water ripple control from their network management and planning functions. As things stand right now, those two elements of the businesses are very, very closely intertwined. And, you know, one works absolutely hand in hand with the other to deliver the lines function service at the lowest possible cost to customers. To require those things to be separated out in some way, and again, the extent of that separation, maybe not clear to us, would be very challenging, we think. And if it weren't achievable, well, what then? You talked a bit about your consultation with the Commerce Commission, which is good to hear, but nevertheless, we still have questions about the consistency of the principles in this guidance with the things that the Commerce Commission requires of EDBs, and, you know, the scope to which this might duplicate or overlap or underlap with some of the requirements the Commission has. We have some concerns. We also note, for example, if we needed to be even-handed with third-party flexibility service providers? Would that, for example, mean making them fully liable for any contribution they might make to SAIDI safety breaches, and what implications that might have for the viability of those services? Moving on, again, most of our concern really is related to the existing legacy hot water ripple control systems. If those needed to be split out of EDB businesses, either through some kind of internal business separation or perhaps entirely sold off, how would that work? Would it be contracted back? We're not quite sure. EDBs are required to ensure that end customers not get less preferable terms because they contract through a third party. EDBs don't control third-party contracts, so how would that be achieved? Yeah. So, I mean, that was pretty quick.